donne je te laisse la parole.
Merci. Bonjour, everyone. And that's about as much as I can say en français. So I'm deeply embarrassed about this, but at least I'm not Canadian, right? So I have an excuse. And I guess, given what I'm going to be talking about today, you might think, well, you need to be doing a better job practicing what you preach of engaging with other cultures and perspectives and everything. But that's what I'm here doing, right? When Nicolas suggested I come and speak to you at this wonderful conference you're having, I was like, I think this is maybe not a very good idea. But I decided, I've got to, as you'll see what I'm talking about today, it's inquiry is a practice of always pushing on the margins and, in a certain sense, always pushing up against the edge of sort of our comfort zone in a certain sense, because we're always engaging with the unknown or alterity or some kind of otherness. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the aims of what I'm doing here, and this is this talk is basically the core of my dissertation that hopefully I'm finishing in a few months' time. So these are the aims that I have. So I want to articulate a model of inquiry as intrinsically motivated by continuously shifting context, something that's deeply situationalist or contextualist. And I want to present an understanding of inquiry as something that's self-reflexive and self-sustaining and a deeply embodied practice. And I think this is what I'm trying to do is basically develop what I perceive as Dewey's model of inquiry. And so in doing this, I want to overturn the traditional model of inquiry as I sort of generally conceive of it, which takes inquiry to something that's very much end-oriented. We're progressing towards truth. Or some kind of end of inquiry, however we might conceive of that. But it's a distinct and fixed point that inquiry is progressing towards. And then I want to go on and argue that continuous engagement with double consciousness, which I take as sort of the core, I guess you might say, methodology at the heart of this practice, or the core way of engaging with this practice that I want to present to you. So I want to argue that continuous engagement with double consciousness is deeply representative of my model of inquiry, and I think I take it to be Dewey's model of inquiry. And importantly, I think this is what I take to be a really great benefit of what I'm advocating, is that it renders inquiry as fundamentally ethical as well as epistemic. The traditional way of thinking about inquiry, the Enlightenment sort of model, says, epistemology comes first, and then once we figure out what's true and what we know, then we do ethics. And I want to say that they're equally fundamental. And Dewey says this as well with his talk about, the importance of values and that sort of thing. Oh, and actually, one second. And a lot of this is inspired, for me personally, about thinking about the whys and hows of inquiry. Why do we inquire? Why do we, as humans, engage in this ridiculous, this process which is so deeply ingrained in us, but which appears to have no sort of end? It just continues on and on. And so a lot of this comes out of my thinking about the tensions present in inquiry, particularly in pragmatist inquiry, between, on the one hand wanting to move forward with confident action and not get caught up in silly theoretical questions, but at the same time we've got to have an element of that skepticism if we're going to build our knowledge further, so to speak, if we're going to continue on and further engage in the practice of inquiry. Okay, so we want to talk about what I conceive of as the sort of the traditional, or maybe the Enlightenment model of inquiry, which is a linear thing. It's going towards a point. I have a diagram I drew. It's easier than trying to do it on a computer, trust me. For me, anyway. So the linear model of inquiry. So as I said before, inquiry progresses towards some kind of fixed end, truth, certainty, consensus, all problems being solved, those sorts of conceptualizations of an end of inquiry. This linear model takes things to be this sort of natural progression. So if we look at this, oh good, I do have a pointer on here. These arrows are inquiry progressing towards this end of inquiry, and so you might imagine these points, these dotted lines here as maybe like, here's, I don't know, the Ptolemaic understanding of the planets and the solar system, and then at this point the Copernican one, and maybe you'd have another one, this Galilean one. So it's this thing that follows this natural course of things, natural progresses in this way that's determined by objective reality, and that's all that we're going off of. And so like I was just saying, the way that I conceive of this is of inquiry as sort of travelling on rails, as being in this predetermined kind of path towards this fixed end. And there's very limited, well, maybe not very limited, but more limited than I would like to imagine, scope for constructive or creative intervention, or the role of experience and conceptualization in inquiry, rather than this model where we just have it following this predetermined kind of path. So, all right. So I want to overturn this linear model of inquiry. I want to overturn this linear model of inquiry, and so I really take Dewey to offer some excellent suggestions of how we can subvert this traditional approach to inquiry. And so obviously anyone who's read very much Dewey knows that he puts experience at the centre of inquiry itself, and then also instead of truth we have a sort of you can have a lot of arguments about this, but some kind of substitute notion, warranted assertability, and so truth, warranted assertability. Truth is not some abstraction. It's not something propositional. It's not something where I say something or I write something and it corresponds to something, magically corresponds to the universe somehow, and that's what makes it true. It's a product of our action and our ability to act. And so I interpret assertability very explicitly in this sense. I think. And if somebody actually can steer me in a way where maybe Dewey says more explicit things like this as well, that might help me actually, although I haven't really fully found it yet. But this idea of if something is true, as in warrantedly assertable, it means that we're able to assert ourselves on that in terms of it being, we're able to assert ourselves upon this, act on it, bring, in a certain way, bring it into the world through our actions. That's all that I take us to mean by truth a lot of the time. Is it's the ability to act. It's something about confidence and certainty, kind of construed contextually. Okay, so these innovations or worthy ideas that I find in Dewey, this leads me to suggest what I call, obviously borrowing from Dewey's terminology, a reconstructive model of inquiry. And so this takes inquiry to be self-reflexive and self-sustaining, and you'll be pleased to know I have another little diagram that I drew. This one's even more chintzy than the other one somehow. I don't know how that worked out. But this is the general idea. It's something that's, rather than being linear, you might say you might say it's circular in a certain sense. It's self-reflexive, it's self-sustaining. And if you're familiar with Dewey's writings on inquiry in things like experience in nature or logic, the theory of inquiry, he lays out this pattern of inquiry. We face indeterminacy. We have this irritation of doubt. We have this irritation of doubt that we perceive, and we naturally, viscerally want to dissolve it, remove it from ourselves. And so then we engage in inquiry, and I take this to be this project of reconstruction. So we engage in inquiry, then we reach determinacy, and then suddenly we have like a new context, a new event, something happens, time's arrow marches on, all the kinds of things that happen in the real world, and then suddenly we might be back to indeterminacy again. And sometimes it's not even that there's some actual new problem that has somehow cropped up. It's just through having the understanding, through reaching this point of determinacy, then once we grasp that kind of understanding, suddenly new questions occur to us, and then suddenly we're back to the indeterminacy again. So it's this ever circling, ever renewing, ever refreshing kind of process. And so how do we engage in this reconstructive process? And I take it to be a matter of constantly shifting perspectives. So when we're faced with indeterminacy, what do we do to try and dissolve the indeterminacy? What do we do to try and get rid of it? And so this is I take it to be a matter of perspective in a certain way. Perspective construed very broadly. But it's about reorienting your thoughts, your preconceptions or your conceptualizations of the world, and basically trying to shift the lens, trying to change the angle of things to somehow get everything to fall back into place, and you have determinacy again, and suddenly you know how to act, what the right thing to do is. How to respond to the situation. So you can think of reconstruction as this sort of experimental process, right? Like you're shifting things around, trying different things, and seeing what happens, seeing if the indeterminacy can be dissolved. And so with this focus on perspective that I've introduced, I think this is really a very useful insight, and it shows, it captures quite well this way in which inquiry is always at the margin of the unknown and the unknown, the certain and the indeterminate, or the familiar and the other. And so we're always switching between these perspectives, trying to reconcile, what we know and what we don't know, what's familiar to us and what is new or novel or alien to us, maybe. And okay, so how do we engage in this process of experimenting with perspectives and this sort of thing? So I take this to be intrinsically a matter of or a practice of double consciousness. So originally, double consciousness comes from W.E. Du Bois. Unfortunately, Du Bois mentions the concept, once in Souls of Black Folk, and everyone cites that, but Du Bois doesn't talk about it anywhere else. I mean, obviously, it deeply informs Du Bois's work, but it's one of those things where it's such a great idea, and he just throws it out there once, and everyone jumped on it, and he never really did any work on it explicitly. But anyway, so double consciousness, we've got this idea of switching between radically distinct worldviews and contexts, and then that leads to some kind of transcendent view. I've put third view here, but maybe that's not really a good way of describing it. It's some kind of transcendent way of being able to see both worlds in a different light. So, for Du Bois, he was a black person living in the US, and so he had that sort of, he had his consciousness from that, but then also he was working in the universities in this white world, and the mixing, him being able to occupy these two worlds simultaneously, means that he could develop this kind of transcendent view that he could never have been able to reach if he hadn't been able to kind of be always on the margins of things. And so this idea of double consciousness, so I want to leave Du Bois behind. So it's been so richly developed in this various strands of feminist and decolonial philosophy, particularly Latina feminism. And so Gloria Anzaldúa, Maria Lugones, Mariana Ortega, Walter Mignolo, Shailesh Sandoval, Chandra Mohanty, Paul Gilroy, Edouard Glissant, it's such a rich... There's so much work out there that so richly pollinates this idea of double consciousness. It's fascinating. And so I could talk about all of these authors in depth and what they add, but I'm going to focus on Gloria Anzaldúa here. So Anzaldúa develops this concept of neplanta, the in-between space. And so this is a quote from her that I think is just amazing. Neplanta, well, it's amazing for me because it speaks to exactly the ideas that I was having. So Nepantla is the site of transformation, the place where different perspectives come into conflict and where you question the basic ideas, tenets, and identities inherited from your family, your education, and your different cultures. Nepantla is the zone between changes where you struggle to find equilibrium. Living between cultures results in seeing double, first from the perspective of one culture, then from the perspective of another. Seeing from two or more perspectives simultaneously renders these cultures transparent. Removed from the culture's centre, you glimpse the sea in which you've been immersed, but to which you were oblivious. And so engaging in reconstructive inquiry is developing one's identity and practice as a Nepantlera, someone who practices Nepantla, someone who lives in that marginal space. And so you're always orienting yourself towards the margin, the unknown, the known and the unknown, the familiar, the other. It's this continuous engagement with perspectives outside of your own. And like I said at the beginning of the talk, this isn't just an epistemic thing. This reaches out into ethics and social relations and all of this sort of stuff. It's not just something about epistemology. And so it's about ethical engagement as much as epistemic. And so this ends up with inquiry as a practice. And so if you recall my reading of Warranted Assertability, so the result of successful inquiry is action being enabled and empowered, and a practice that's always ongoing, always engaged in this double consciousness. And so I've got another quote from Anzaldúa: "Navigating the cracks is the process of reconstructing life anew, of fashioning new identities. Nepantleras use competing systems of knowledge and rewrite their identities." And then also I've got another very apt quote. Anzaldúa also actually uses this Leonard Cohen quote. I wish I could say I just came up with this independently. But famous Quebecer, or notable Quebecer, Leonard Cohen: "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Okay, merci.